So Georgia football's rushing attack is in decline. All you have to do is look at the last 4 seasons. The numbers bear it out very clearly. Now, in decline relative to what they were in the national championship years of 2021 and 2022. But they're headed in the wrong direction. The question tonight that you need to ask yourself and that I'm asking myself is that good enough? Is that good enough moving forward? What they've done the last 2 years with an SEC championship in the middle of it, is that good enough moving forward, or are they going to have to do something else? That's what we're going to talk about tonight on the How About That DAWGSCAST. Now, we're really just going to start at the beginning because there's nowhere the place to start. We're going to go all the way back to 2021, and we're talking about the offensive line specifically here, okay? We're not talking about the overall offense. We're not talking about the running backs, although they clearly are a factor. And we're not talking about Georgia's recruiting because we all know that they're talented top to bottom on the roster. But inside that talented roster, things have shifted a little bit. Things have changed. So we're trying to look into the future here and decide, is what we've seen the last couple of years good enough? At the end of the day, nothing matters anymore, it seems, except winning in the college football playoff and national titles. Now, I'm of the opinion you can still have a great season and not win a national championship, but I digress. Tonight, we're looking at the offensive line specifically and Georgia's pursuit moving forward and winning another national championship and whether or not that's going to be good enough. So if we go back to 2021, let's set the table. Since we're talking about the offensive line in particular, the man behind that offensive line was Matt Luke. Now, I'm going to be honest with you. I knew Matt Luke had a good reputation when he was at Ole Miss as the head coach, as being a good coach, an aggressive, fiery offensive line coach. But when they hired him, I didn't know exactly what to make of it. But of course, he showed up in 2021. Well, he didn't show up in 2021, but he was on the 2021 team as the offensive line coach. And this was the group he was working with. And I want you to pay attention to the names that are here. We're talking about Justin Schaefer was a starter. Jamari Salyer was a starter. Warren McClendon, a starter. Backed up, oh, by the way, by a first rounder in the NFL draft, Amarius Mims. So was Sawyer, backed up by a first rounder in Broderick Jones. Eric Warrenson got the start at one of the other positions, and Cedric Van Pran was already the starter. That unit led the Dogs to a national championship. They were coached by Matt Luke. And I was shocked, frankly, after this national championship when Matt Luke decided that he wanted to move on. Now, I'm sure there's a story there. I wish I had that story to share with you tonight. If I ever get my hands on that story or have a source that I can bring on who knows that story, we're going to have that conversation. But for tonight, let's just say that after not being sure about Matt Luke, I was sad to see him go because of the way he had coached up that unit. Now, granted, they were talented, but they had done what they needed to do, especially in that national championship game in the second half, and brought the Dogs a national championship. Now, of course, they had great running backs behind them, but that's how football works, right? It's give and take, a little bit of this, a little bit of that. So, Matt Luke, out. Where does Kirby Smart turn? He turns to a familiar face to Georgia Bulldog football fans in STACY SEARELS. Now, as with every coaching hire, when a new coach comes in, people are going to have their opinion. Good, bad, good enough, not good enough. Why are we doing retreads? You name it. That's the kind of stuff that comes up when you bring in a new coach. It's inevitable. But look at who he was working with in 2022. Coach SEARELS comes in. The cupboard is far from bare. He's got Broderick Jones, Amarius Mims at the tackle position. He's got Devin Willock or Xavier Truss at the left guard position. Cedric Van Pran returned at center. Tate Ratledge, who would go on to be an All-American, was starting at guard. He was backed up by Jared Wilson, who was going to eventually be a starter at center. And then you got Warren McClendon or Amarius Mims at the other tackle, both of which are NFL players. Another talented group. So SEARELS walked into a good situation. He walked into a situation where the offensive coordinator was back. The Dogs were coming off the national championship, and they rolled in 2022. 15-0, a second consecutive national title, and STACY SEARELS was the man behind that offensive line. So really quick, let's go back and just look at the numbers for what happened in 2021. Under Matt Luke, the Dogs rushed for 2,864 yards. That's pretty good. They averaged 191 yards per game on the ground, 5.3 yards per carry, and they punched it in the end zone 29 times on the ground. That was under Matt Luke in 2021. That offense was good, not great. That offense was very efficient, but we knew that they could run the ball when they had to. The numbers bore it out. That was good enough for 37th overall as far as where the Dogs ranked in rush offense that season, a national championship season. If you look at 22, under STACY SEARELS, the Dogs finished 19th in the nation. So statistically, they improved. They finished with 3,080 yards on the ground in 2022, 205 yards plus per game on the ground, with an average of 5.5 yards per carry, but they went into the end zone 44 times on the ground. Now, granted, you had a mobile quarterback factoring into that. They did it a couple other different ways, right? Sweeps, reverses, that kind of stuff. But the point is, on the ground, the Dogs were chewing them up and spitting them out in 2022. And we've already addressed that they've got NFL talent on that line. That 22 team was an absolute monster. The offense was better in every way, but especially on the ground. So, was that the maturity of those talented players who would eventually move on to the NFL? Was it STACY SEARELS and his input, new blood, right, coming into the program? Was it a combination of that plus the great running backs that they had in 2022? Of course, it's all of it, but we're focusing on the offensive line. Now, here's where things get really, really interesting, because when we start to take a look at 2023, SEARELS is back. He's out there recruiting for Georgia. He's out there settling in. Everybody knows what is expected by this point in time from STACY SEARELS and his offensive line. And they have a quarterback that was taking over in Carson Beck. So there was a lot of change. But one of the things that felt a little more stable was SEARELS' unit along the offensive line. Now, just to recall, these names that I'm giving you, these are the starting lineups for the last game in each of these seasons, okay? So in 21, that was the group that took the field against Alabama for the national title. In 22, that was the group that took the field against TCU. So in 23, this line that we're looking at here was the group that took the field against Florida State in the Orange Bowl. So we're looking at Ernest Green starting at one tackle, Fairchild at guard, Cedric Van Pram back at center, an established team leader, Tate Ratledge at guard, who would go on to be an All-American that year. And you had Xavier Truss at right tackle, or Marius Mims when he was healthy. But by the end of the year, he chose not to play in that game. In 2023, the Dogs ran for 2,677 yards. Not bad. Really close to what they had in 2021. Georgia's season as a whole in 23 looked a lot like the 21 year, right? Undefeated regular season, 8-0 in conference play. They lose in the SEC title game, except in 23, they didn't get a chance to play for the national championship. The numbers looked about the same, a little bit lower, but very close. They averaged 191 yards per game on the ground, same as in 21. They averaged 5.3 yards per carry on the ground in 23, exactly the same as it was in 21. They even had more touchdowns than they did in 21, not quite as many as 22. They punched it in 40 times on the ground in 23. A new offensive coordinator, Mike Bobo, had taken over, but everything looked really similar to the way it had looked in 21 and 22. It just didn't break Georgia's way, so there was really no need to sound alarms when it comes to the offensive line or the offensive line coach, or to question what it was that Georgia was getting done. SEARELS was still out there recruiting. Here's where I should mention to you that the 2024 Georgia Bulldog recruiting class was the #1 recruiting class in the country. The 2023 recruiting class for Georgia was the #2 recruiting class in the country. Now, obviously, we're not just talking about the offensive line here. There are a lot of places along the team that got beefed up with highly rated prospects. That's why those rankings are the way they are. And that might be covering up part of Georgia's problem here, actually. Because as we look at 2024, we see the group that was expected to take the field, and then this is the group that they finished with at the end of the year. So you had Ernest Green at left tackle. You had Dylan Fairchild at one of the guards. Jared Wilson was your starting center. Tate Ratledge, who had overcome injury, was your starting guard. And Xavier Truss was starting at right tackle for you by the time the season got to the end. This was a season where the Dogs had lost twice, but they had won the SEC title game, and they were expected to do things in the playoff. But if we saw anything against Notre Dame, we saw that Georgia simply could not run the ball, and they hadn't been able to run the ball all year. And I debated and talked about it on here a lot about whether or not that was because Georgia was more of a pass-first offense and they were going to lean on Carson Beck because they thought he was the best player on that unit, and that's who they needed to be depending on. Problem there was, of course, the wide receivers didn't do a good job of helping him out. And then the running backs were injured all the time. The offensive line was injured seemingly all season long. Things just never seemed to come together for Georgia. And a lot of that is circumstantial. But at the end of the day, the numbers tell a story that isn't pretty. In 2024, Georgia rushed for 1,742 yards. That's 1,000 yards less on the ground in 24 than they had in 23. 1,000 yards, right at it. They averaged 124 yards on the ground per game in 2024. That's 70 yards, essentially, less on the ground per game. They averaged 4.1 yards per carry in 24. That's more than a yard less every time they handed the ball to a running back. And they only went into the end zone 24 times on the ground. So by any metric, 24 was a step back. All those sad sack numbers led the Dogs to finishing 102 in the country in rush offense. 102 for a Georgia Bulldogs offense that when you think about Georgia, you think about they play great defense, they run the football when they want to, and they dominate along the lines of scrimmage. That clearly did not happen in 2024 for Georgia. So, is it because of those overly inflated recruiting rankings that make us feel really good as Georgia Bulldog fans, but they weren't exactly hitting when it came to offensive linemen and elite players? Is it starting to show up when you have these injuries, when you have less than elite running backs? Is this just what you get? And then you say, is that good enough? Why did that happen? Where's the focus? I think we're going to find out a lot moving ahead into 2025 because STACY SEARELS is still the man. He's still the offensive line coach at Georgia. I don't expect that's going to change unless something unforeseen happens here heading into spring practice, because they're working out now. We're about to get into the run up to spring practice. It's going to be here before we know it. STACY SEARELS is the guy. Georgia's recruiting well. The last couple of years, they brought in a lot of bodies because they knew they were going to have to replenish the offensive line. The thing is, those kids weren't ready to play in 24, and we don't know exactly what they are moving here into 25. We're going to have to learn it on the field. Can STACY, Coach SEARELS, can he get out there and turn this unit into the kind of unit that Georgia had in 21 and 22, where not only were they winning national championships, but they were also being considered favorites or front runners or at least contenders for the Joe Moore Award, the offensive line award that honors the best offensive line in the country. Those discussions were being had by me and other people, even though the Dogs didn't win those awards in at least the second season in 22. We thought they were flat robbed, that they should have won the Joe Moore Award. STACY SEARELS was the head coach then too. So is it STACY SEARELS? Is it recruiting? Is that where they're falling off? Did they miss on a player here or there? Is it because of the injuries, both to the running back position and to the offensive line? Is it because of a lack of balance in the offense? Because, yeah, Georgia's throwing it, but they weren't catching it in 24. So you can look at the statistics and say, well, Georgia was pass heavy. Well, that's fine, I guess, as long as you catch it and you're moving down the field, but that's not what happened for Georgia. And then they weren't getting it done on the ground to the tune of 1,000 yards less than they ran it in 2023. So the question for all of us as Georgia Bulldog fans to answer is that good enough? I think Coach SEARELS, Kirby Smart, they've earned the right to go out there, put this unit together, show up in 25 and show us, right? But Kirby's already made his choice, at least for the time being. He's looking at things we're not looking at. He's looking at it holistically. And he seems comfortable with his offensive coordinator. He seems comfortable with the bodies he has in that room, the offensive line room. He seems comfortable with STACY SEARELS as his offensive line coach. So, as fans, we just get to sit back and see what they can turn it all into. Will they be able to show up in 25 and get back closer to what they were in 21, 22, even 23? Because you don't have to lead the country in rushing to be a national championship team. But what you do have to be able to do is run an offense that's balanced, that gives you the opportunity to run it when you want to run it, and gives you the confidence to know that you can run it when you have to run it. That's what Georgia has to be able to do. We all know that Kirby Smart wants to play complementary football, that he wants his offense to help his defense, that he wants his defense to help his offense and his special teams to help them both. I think that the talent that has been brought in along the offensive line deserves the opportunity to get coached up and go out there and show us what they're capable of here in 2025. If Coach SEARELS and Coach Smart are able to turn this unit back into something closer to what we saw in 23, then Georgia's future is going to be bright because there are new weapons all over the field, regardless of who's taking snaps at quarterback. We know that this is going to be a season of change in Athens. There's no two ways around it. But just because things are new, just because change is happening, that doesn't mean that it has to be bad. It just means that it's going to be different. And this unit has every opportunity to go out there and show us just exactly what they're made of. Now, they're going to have to grow up kind of quick. The first couple of games of the year are going to give them an opportunity to get their feet wet. We're going to actually get to see a lot of these young players, I would imagine. And then by the time we get into week 3 and 4, you have Alabama and Tennessee coming to town. The Dogs are going to have to be right if they expect to win those games. They're going to be challenged because that Tennessee game's on the road. They're going to be challenged because that Alabama squad is probably a top 10 preseason team. They feel pretty good about their opportunities as well. Yeah, we know it's going to be crazy in Athens for that game. That has to help Georgia. But it doesn't matter how loud or how boisterous the home field is if you can't block them up front, if you can't run when you want to, if you can't protect the passer. So, Coach SEARELS has to get it right. Kirby Smart has made his choice. That's his guy. That's who he's betting on. And if Georgia's going to get back, remain a contender for the SEC title, and get back to being a contender for national championships, it's all going to come down to what they can do along the lines of scrimmage and specifically along the offensive line, because Georgia has to reverse the trend from what we've seen between 2021 and 2024. The question is, do they have the talent and the ability to do it? Do they have the connection? Do they have all those intangibles? Can they stay healthy? Again, I don't think it's all in any one coach. But I will say that what we saw in 2024, regardless of the reasons it happened, what we saw from Georgia in 2024 along the offensive line, their level of play, their style of play, the attitude that we watched them play with, that's not good enough. SEARELS knows that, I think. Kirby Smart definitely knows it. But I think he also knows what he has in that room. And that's why I'm willing to sit back, see what they can show us in the spring, look forward to what we see in 2025. But if things don't improve, what we've seen so far, the trajectory of the team, the trajectory of the offensive line, not good enough. Frankly, the trajectory of the recruiting on the offensive line, not good enough. And if we don't see a turnaround in 2025, then I will be among those voices who are saying it's time to look for a change at the offensive line coach position. because Georgia can't be who and what they want to be if they can't dominate along the offensive front. And that starts with players, and then it comes back to coaching, execution, and attitude. Injuries are a part of the game. That happens everywhere. Georgia, under Kirby Smart, will always go attempt to get the best players they can get out of the high school ranks year after year after year. The recruiting rankings show that. The recruiting rankings show us that. So, at some point, you have to hold the people who are in charge of those individual rooms accountable. And if you want to drill down a little bit deeper, if the trajectories continue, then you have to have a real conversation about the offensive coordinator position as well. That we can leave for another day. But as far as the offensive line is concerned, what we saw in 2024, not good enough. But I am willing to give them free reign here in 2025 to go out there and show me, because I know they're young and I have high hopes that the coaches know what they're doing and they're going to be able to pull this thing back to more of a 2023 level or better. Because when you've got Nate Frazier and other backs that have the ability to break the game open anytime they touch the football, that can make any offensive line look better. So we'll see how it all shakes out. I'm looking forward to it. One thing is for sure is that Georgia turns out top quality players, and the way they do things at Georgia is a little bit different than the way they do things everywhere else. And if you don't believe me, that kind of thing matters. If you didn't know, there was a big game that took place this last weekend in the professional ranks. It's called the Super Bowl. The Eagles, the Chiefs were in it. The Eagles wound up winning that thing. And I was happy to see that happen for a couple of different reasons. But nothing made me happier than what I heard in the week leading up to the game and then was borne out during the game. If you missed it, I'm going to play that for you now about exactly what made the Eagles different this year, why they were different than they have been in years past, and then ultimately we know how that led to a world title. Check it out.
A lot of players said that this year's team is far more connected than last year and even the team that went to the Super Bowl 2 years ago. What have you seen in terms of that connection, and why is that so important?
Well, I say to that, I think a big part of it has to do with the Georgia background on defense. You know, and I think that starts with Kobe Dean and all those guys that were able to play ball in college together and bring their ways to the league. And so I think that has a big impact on our culture, on defense, how they play, how together they are. And then I think that kind of seeps through the team in many ways.
There you have it from the man himself, the Super Bowl MVP and newly minted world champion Jalen Hurts. He let you know that what the Eagles did in drafting all those Georgia Bulldogs, affectionately known as the Philly Dogs, what difference it has made in a professional program up there. I think what we can take away from this as Georgia Bulldogs fans is that A, Kirby Smart knows how to evaluate talent. B, they know how to develop players once they get them on campus. All you have to do is look at Jordan Davis, who's right there in the middle of this picture. But more than that, it shows you that Kirby Smart is a relentless recruiter, and he understands that having the best players usually means you're going to have an opportunity to end up as the best team. But more than that, it's leadership. It's the way you get after it. It's the way you go about your business. Those standards that I talked about in a recent episode. That is what this group you see on the screen here are all about, especially Nakobe Dean, Nolan Smith. This is what made Georgia great when they were here. It's what has made Philadelphia great in the NFL. And it's not hokey. Even though those guys are all professionals now, there's nothing hokey about it. If you buy into it and you're playing for the person next to you and you go about your work in the way that a champion goes about their work day after day, even though you're not winning a championship every time you step on the practice field, if you hold yourself to that standard and you push to achieve that standard and demand it from the person beside you, well, eventually that's all going to break through and everybody's going to see that, you know what, that's not a bad idea. I think I want to do it that way too. And moving forward, when you lose players like this out of a program the way Georgia has, as much as Kirby informs us that they have great leaders on these teams each year, that somebody steps up, I'm certain that happens. I have no doubt that's true. But These dudes clearly had a little bit of something extra when it came to those intangibles. That's part of what made Georgia different. And you don't just grow those dudes on trees, but you can go recruit them. They are out there, and Kirby and his staff are chasing them down. So if there's anything that I have full faith in, it's that Kirby and his staff are going to go get the best high school recruits they can get every year. And they know what they're looking for. You just saw the model of what it looks like to be a Georgia Bulldog. That's the kind of person that they're looking for to bring into the program. So as long as that's going on under Kirby Smart, I really don't have any major concerns about the program, where we're headed and what we are. But it is so good to see that these young men didn't just do that at Georgia, that it became, if it wasn't a part of who they were, it added to who they became. And then they took it with them moving forward. And now they're champions again. Is Georgia good enough on the offensive line under Coach STACY SEARELS? Is this what we should expect moving forward, or are there going to have to be changes made? I am one who is not calling for changes right now at that position. Certainly, Kirby's already made his choice. He's rolling with Mike Bobo and STACY SEARELS moving into 2025. Given the fact that they're having to turn that unit over so much, and a lot of those recruits that they brought in the last couple of years were pretty highly touted, not 5 stars necessarily, but highly touted individuals, I am more than willing to give them a chance to go out there and show me that they can coach them up, and Georgia can get back to being more of what I want them to be, what I know them to be, what I saw them be in 2021, 2022, and then in 2023. But the trajectory is headed in the wrong direction, and that is something that STACY SEARELS, Kirby Smart, Mike Bobo, they're all going to have to get turned around. Otherwise, we aren't going to be able to be talking about SEC championships, much less a national championship, again, anytime here soon. That's all for this week. Thank you for being here. Y'all take care of yourselves, your friends, your families, each other, and go Dogs!
Told them, how about them fucking dogs? That's what I told them.